Okay. The last couple of days we've been talking about things that are leading up to the American Revolution, to this Declaration of Independence that takes place in July of 1776. We've talked about different taxes that the English have levied on their colonies: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, that tax on manufactured goods. And then yesterday we talked about the Intolerable Acts, the British Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Quartering Act, the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, and then the Quebec Act. And which one of those five acts has the greatest impact on Georgia?
The one about quartering?
The Quartering Act. That's absolutely right. And then, of course, we talked about the Boston Massacre, which took place in March of 1770, and then the Boston Tea Party that took place in December of 1773. Those events lead us to 1774. And in 1774, the First Continental Congress meets. Georgia doesn't show up. Georgia does not send a delegate to the First Continental Congress. In fact, they're the only colony that does not. And that kind of gives you an idea of what it was like in Georgia at the time. Remember, we talked yesterday about the fact that there are those that are in favor of independence. There are those that are opposed to independence. And I gave you some reasons why. One of the big ones being that Georgia likes being a part of Britain. It's been very productive for them. Their economy has flourished under the British. And they need that protection. We mentioned that several times yesterday. They needed that protection from the Indians that lived in the area. So Georgia doesn't send a delegate in 1774. Things have not gotten to the point where they're ready to do that. What the First Continental Congress does is they vote to cut off all trade with England until England is willing to repeal the taxes and England is willing to restore trade with the rest of the world. Because one thing we haven't mentioned is that England cut off America's trade with anybody else in the world. England was their only trading partner. Now, did they pay attention to it? Not particularly. They continued to trade with other countries, but it was illegal. The colonies said, okay, if you can do that to us, we'll just turn around and do it to you. And they do. The Second Continental Congress is set to meet, but before that happens, fighting breaks out in 1775 at a place, actually two different places, Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And that becomes known as something. What does that become known as?
Midnight Rider, Paul Revere.
Okay, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is a horrible poem, by the way. It's an epic poem, and it's so historically inaccurate. But that's okay. It is good literature. Okay? But somebody said something, the shot heard around the world. Okay? And why does that become known as the shot heard around the world? Because for the first time in the history of the world, one people is fighting for their freedom from a monarchy, from a tyrannical monarchy. At least that's how the colonists feel. So, let's see what we can come up with. Because, we're all about having fun. So, here we go. You got to watch the Lego commercial first. Why is that so loud? Shh. Okay.
Now the ride of Paul Revere set the nation on its ear, and the shock at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn, the War of Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled. on to Concord, marched the foe to seize the arsenal. There you know, waiting folks, searching all around. Till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge, we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shocker of the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your powder, take your gun, report to General Washington. Hurry him in, there's not an hour to lose. Now at famous Bunker Hill, even though we lost, it was quite a thrill. The rebel Colonel Prescott proved he was wise. Outnumbered and low on ammunition as the British stormed his position. He said, hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Though the next few years were rough, General Washington's men knew they were tough. Those hungry, ragged boys would not be beat. One night they crossed the Delaware, surprised the Hessians in their lair, and a valley force had just bundled up their feet. Now the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The men were ready on the move. Take your flame, take your sun, report to General Washington. We got our rights and now it's time to prove. Well, they showed such determination that they won the admiration of countries across the sea like France and Spain, who owned the colony ships and guns and put the British on the run and the Continental Army on its feet again. And though they lost some battles too, the Americans swore they see it through. Their raiding parties kept up hit and run. And Yorktown could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally we had won. Hooray! I'm shot around the world. To the end of the revolution, the Continental rebel took the day. And the father of our country beat the British there at Yorktown, brought freedom to you and me and the USA. America, let freedom ring.
They just don't make stuff like that anymore. And there might be a reason for it. I'm not sure. But do what? Yeah, there is. There is. So this moment in history becomes not just a part of American history, but it becomes a part of world history because it gave hope to people around the world. And the document that comes along in 1776 that we're about to dissect and look at does that same thing. It brings hope. It brought hope, and it continues to bring hope to people who don't live like you and I do, who don't have the freedoms that you and I enjoy. You want to hear another one? Yes. This one's actually better. Don't you think, Miss Lee?
Yeah, that's crazy is good.
Shh.
Oh, they had a gun that fired a shot that was heard clear around the world. Darndest thing I ever heard.
Darndest thing I ever heard of.
What?
What kind of gun?
What kind of gun what?
You know what kind of gun? The kind of gun that can fire a shot that can be heard clear around the world. Tell us about that gun.
Well, there was this fella. You sure you want to hear this story? It's history.
For Pete's sake, tell the story.
Well, one time, a long time ago, this country was a part of England, and we wasn't getting along with them too good. In fact, we was thinking about breaking away and starting our own country. But the king over there in England, he said, you do that, and I'm going to send my redcoats. They was British soldiers, and he was going to send them over here to whoop us.
Nerve.
And he says, you better think about that thing. Well, so your great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddies all got together, to think about it. And they argued about it back and forth a while. And finally one of them says, let's do it. Let's start our own country. Somebody says, how you do that? Says, I don't know. Says, I reckon you just start. Says, what do we call it? Says, let's call it the United States of America.
That was a good name.
Yeah. About that time, up in Boston, Massachusetts, there's a fellow living up there named Paul Revere. And he was a pretty good old fellow. Just as poor as Joe's turkey, but he was a pretty good old fellow. And he owned a real good old horse named Natty. Now, Paul, he was wandering around the streets up there one night, and he come up on a friend of his. And he says, howdy, what's new? His friend says, what's new? Says, the British is coming. That's what's new. What's the matter with thee? And Paul says, you'll kick. He says, it's a fact. Says, I just heard it from an Indian. And you know them Indians, they keep their ears to the ground. And Paul says, do the folks know about this? The fellow says, I just heard about it myself. And Paul says, well, what we going to do? The fellow says, I'm getting out of town. And Paul says, well, we got to spread the word. He says, you spread it. I'm getting out of town. Well, Paul didn't know what to do. But he knew he had to do something. Now it happened that they had planned, if the British was ever to come over here, and then put a light in this high church steeple. Paul went down there to look. And sure enough, there was the light, burning brighter than day. Well, Paul, he jumped on his old horse and he lit out. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to go somewhere. Oh, I wish you could have seen it. That old horse with his ears laid back and his nostrils wide open for sucking in wind like a jet engine, feet pounding on them cobblestones, striking off sparks, Paul holding on for dear life and hollering at the top of his lungs. He says, the British is coming, the British is coming. Get you a gun, we gonna have us a revolution. And them farmers come piling out of the hay like bees out of a beehive. Minutemen there's coming. They grab their squirrel guns.
What's Minutemen?
Minutemen? There's fellows that had to be ready at a minute's notice. And when Paul comes screeching down the road that way, they grab their guns and hid out behind the weeds and walls and trees and everywhere. Everywhere. And when the British come prancing along, all dressed up in their red suits and waving to the girls, they let them have it. It was a sight to see. And then it happened.
They fired the gun.
They fired the gun. And the shot was so loud, it was heard clear around the world.
Oh, get out.
It's back. That's the way this country starts.
Well, kind of. I don't know that what Andy said there would hold up in a court of law, but there is some truth to it. And again, the idea of this shot heard around the world, that it impacted the world. That's the thing. And we actually see a lot of things like that throughout history. Events, speeches, moments that impact, it's in my pocket, that impact not just our society, not just our history, but impact the world. Today, this idea of being able to go out and gain your freedom by fighting against tyranny, by fighting against people who are oppressive, it's just part of our world now, and people are encouraged by what happened here in the United States over 200 years ago. So, in June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress meets, and this time Georgia decides they'll show up. Georgia is represented at the Second Continental Congress. And what comes out of the Second Continental Congress that everybody remembers is the Declaration of Independence. Right here, this thing, the Declaration of Independence. All right? But there's some things that happened before the Declaration of Independence is written. And the big thing, and it's something that very few people, unless you're, an American history geek, know about, and that is Lee's resolution. It's a very small document. It's a very minor document in American history. But it paves the way. It introduces the Declaration of Independence that comes a month later. Lee's resolution is written and it is read to the Second Second Continental Congress by Richard Henry Lee. He's from Virginia. What other Lee is from Virginia? And they are related. Richard Henry Lee would have been Robert E. Lee's cousin, second cousin, I believe. Richard Henry Lee and Robert E. Lee's father, or grandfather rather, were second or first cousins. So Robert E. Lee and Richard Henry Lee would have been third cousins. By the way, Robert E. Lee's grandfather had a great name. Are you ready for it? Light Horse Harry Lee. That was his nickname, Light Horse Harry, because he was an excellent horseman, light on the horse. Lee is instructed by the people of Virginia, by the Assembly of Virginia, to go before the Continental Congress and propose three things. And they form the basis of what today we call Lee's Resolution. It takes place on June the 7th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is approved when? July 4th, 1776. So about a month after Lee's resolution, the Declaration of Independence comes about. July 4th, and these are the three things that Lee's resolution contained. It contained a call for a Declaration of Independence. If we're going to seek our independence from Great Britain, we have to tell people why. And so there's a Declaration of Independence. That comes out on July the 4th. The second thing is there is a call to form alliances, a call to reach out to other countries that might be interested in helping us defeat the English, defeating the British. That begins in September of 1776. Benjamin Franklin goes to France and begins to talk to the French government about helping the colonies gain their freedom. And then thirdly, there is a plan for confederation. Now, here's your question. What's a confederation? That is one of your vocabulary words, I believe. But what is a confederation? Anybody know? Nobody studied those words yet? What's today? Wednesday? What's today? Wednesday? When's your quiz on those words? Friday. Yeah. I put that up there the day I gave you the words. So a confederation is a loose organization. It's a loose gathering of countries or states. In this instance, it's colonies to accomplish something. They have a common purpose. Really what a confederation is in this instance, a plan for confederation is a plan of government. The Constitution is our nation's plan for government, but it was not the first. The first came out in November of 1777, and it was called the Articles of Confederation. Y'all ever heard of that? Okay. Well, that is a result of Lee's resolution. There's a committee that is put together, and the head of that committee is Thomas Jefferson. And the Committee of Five is what they are called. And the Committee of Five actually is responsible for writing the Declaration of Independence. But in reality, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. And everybody knew it. And we'll talk about TJ here in just a minute. But the Committee of Five is Thomas Jefferson, James Adams, Benjamin Franklin. Everybody heard of those guys? Okay. Benjamin Franklin, inventor, diplomat, writer, publisher, just did a lot of things in life. He did not invent electricity. He played in a thunderstorm and found out about electricity, though. James Adams is the second president of the United States, a diplomat, politician, prolific writer. Thomas Jefferson, arguably the brightest person ever born on the North American continent. John F. Kennedy in 1962 had the Nobel Prize winners in the White House. He hosted a dinner, and he said at this dinner, "Never before has there been such a gathering of talent since Thomas Jefferson dined in the White House alone." So, 100 years after his death, over 100 years after his death, John F. Kennedy is really remarking about the intelligence and the talent that Thomas Jefferson had. And he did a lot of remarkable things, Thomas Jefferson did. Now, the other two you've never heard of. You want to know who they are? You probably should. Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston. Okay. Thomas Jefferson takes the month of June, writes the Declaration of Independence, and it is adopted by Congress on July 4, 1776. It's actually brought before Congress on July the 2nd. James Adams jumps the gun a little bit, and he says, "This will be the day. This will be the most memorable day in the history of the world, certainly in the history of our country." He was close. He said this: Independence Day, and he's talking about July the 2nd, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Do we celebrate the 4th of July today? We do. With what? Games, barbecue, sports, guns. Some people do, they shoot it up in the air and it comes down and lands on their head. Because remember, what goes up must come down. And so John Adams, it should be John Adams. No, it should be James Adams. One was father, one was son. Maybe it was John Adams. Anyway, he's right. He's just wrong about the date. Instead of July 2nd, it's July 4th. Georgia has 3 signers of the Declaration. These are their signatures, Butt and Gwinnett, and we'll talk more about Butt and Gwinnett as we start talking about the actual events that take place in Georgia. He's a fascinating guy. His signature is probably the most rare. It's the rarest of these 3 guys, and there's a reason for that. Then you have Lyman Hall, and then George Walton. And you've probably heard of at least their last names: Gwinnett County, Hall County, Walton County. And if you may have played against George Walton Academy in some athletic contest. So those 3 guys signed the Declaration of Independence from Georgia. Now, this is Lee's resolution. That's actually a copy of it there on the right. It doesn't look like much. It's not a fancy document. It's handwritten, and it's almost like he wrote it on his dinner napkin. Okay? The vote is there, aye and nay. And then these strange numbers are here, and I have never been able to figure out why they're there right here. It's not a vote count. It's not, I don't know what it is. And I can't find it, so I'm going to have to keep digging. But Lee's resolution says this: 3 things. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Yes, ma'am. So, what is this? What is that part? The declaration of, we got to declare our independence. The second part, we got to have people to help us. That it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances. We got to have people to help us. And then thirdly, that a plan of confederation, plan of government, be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. And that becomes the Articles of Confederation. So that's Lee's resolution. Again, there's not much to it, but it sets the wheels in motion. Somebody had to say, hey, we need to do some things. And it's Richard Henry Lee that says that. And people act on it. So, here's Richard Henry Lee. He has some big hands, if you'll notice. That right hand is massive. Anyway, so what we want to do for the next, 20 minutes or so, 15 minutes, whatever time we have left, is we want to begin looking at the Declaration of Independence. We want to tear it apart and look at it piece by piece. Real simple thing that we're going to do. Again, let's go back to Thomas Jefferson. He is the main author. Even though there are 5 men who make up the Committee of 5, it is Thomas Jefferson who does the majority of the writing. By the way, that is John Adams. I don't know why I said James, because that's his son. And interesting story about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They're basically 7 years apart in age. Adams is older. Adams becomes the 2nd president of the United States. He follows George Washington. And if I can just give you a word of advice, never follow a legend. If you're going to coach or you're going to go into a job, never follow a legend. Never follow somebody that set the bar really high. And George Washington set the bar really high. John Adams was never going to reach, he was never going to be George Washington. What? Yeah, you might have. Yeah. You don't have any choice in it, though. So, John Adams is the 2nd president. Thomas Jefferson becomes the 3rd president. And as their careers progress, they begin to really dislike one another. Hate is probably not too strong a word to use to describe the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were in different political parties. But they did work together. John Adams was probably Jefferson's biggest editor. He probably made the most changes in the Declaration of Independence from where Jefferson wrote it. Doesn't make Jefferson happy. Like most people who are the smartest in the room, they're the smartest in the room for a reason. And they're very aware. And Jefferson was aware of it. He's a little, I don't know, he might have been a little proud of his intelligence. But they grow to hate one another. January of 1812, in fact, January 1st, 1812, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson live fairly close to one another in Virginia. John Adams writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And in that letter, he said, basically, it's time to put things behind us. And he wished Thomas Jefferson the happiest of New Years and many more to come. Jefferson responds, I agree. And they begin to write one another. And for the next 14 years, they write letters to one another. And they're fascinating letters. You get some great insight into both of these men. July 4th, 1826. How many years is that from 1776? 50. 50 years. It's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson lies on his deathbed. John Adams lies on his deathbed. Neither man will see July the 5th. John Adams is 90. Thomas Jefferson is 83. Adams is breathing his last, and his last words were reported to be, Jefferson still survives. He was wrong. He didn't know that Jefferson had died 5 hours before. And so one of those little weird things about history, gives you chills if you let it. is two signers of the Declaration of Independence. Two of our founding fathers die on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, just hours apart. And that's just one of those weird things. Now, this picture, I'm not showing you all of this picture. This picture is one of those massive paintings that hangs in the rotunda. And it shows all 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock is sitting right here because he's the president of the Continental Congress. And then all the other signers, all the delegates to the Congress are there. The guy that painted this picture had a wicked sense of humor. Because in the painting, if you look carefully, and you don't have to look all that carefully, actually, you can go online and look at it. Jefferson, this is Adams, this is Jefferson. That's Benjamin Franklin, of course. But Jefferson is standing on Adams' foot. I know, you can't see it, but it is there. Jefferson is standing on Adams' foot, and it's just the artist's attempt to inject some humor into what was going on, because he knew how adversarial Adams and Jefferson would become later in life. Congress does accept the Declaration of Independence, but only after some wording about slavery is taken out. There's some wording that attacks the institution of slavery. And this becomes America's first opportunity to rid the nation of that institution. And they don't take advantage of it. In 1789, 13 years later, they write the Constitution of the United States. And they have the opportunity to rid the nation of slavery. And they don't take advantage of it. What?
Thomas Jefferson not put slavery to be abolished in the Declaration of Independence?
No, he wanted it to be abolished.
But he wanted it, but he didn't put it there because he didn't want to lose
No, he wanted, in his original writing, he wanted slavery to be gone. But these guys, the other four that are on the committee of five, step in and go, we can't do that. For all those reasons you're talking about. But it's not Jefferson. Jefferson, he's willing to get rid of it. He realizes this is an opportunity to rid ourselves of slavery. And of course, they don't. Again, 13 years later, they have the opportunity to rid the nation of slavery. And they don't. And then for the next 70 years, they have the opportunity, repeated opportunities, to rid the nation of slavery, and they don't. And in fact, in many cases, they make it worse. The Supreme Court finally says, you know what? Slaves are not people. They're property. And because they're property, they have no rights. And that's the U.S. government. Okay? So, one of the negative things about the Declaration of Independence is that it does not address that issue. It does not rid the nation of that. And things would have been much different and things would have been much easier. This would have never happened. Believe me, that would have never happened had the government stepped up and taken care of it. But they don't. And they don't till war breaks out. Okay, one of the things that Jefferson takes advantage of is the Enlightenment period. He's a child of the Enlightenment. And that is simply an intellectual movement from the 17th and 18th centuries. And it emphasizes a couple of things. It emphasizes reason and rational thought instead of tradition. Well, the world's flat. Why? Because we've always said the world is flat. Okay? But you use reason and you use rational thought and you realize, wait a minute, the world ain't flat. Okay? Science becomes a big deal. Individualism rather than the group. And so people begin to think in different ways. They begin to think outside the box, so to speak. And Jefferson in particular uses the ideas of a man named John Locke, who was a product of the Enlightenment. He's one of those great thinkers that lived during the Enlightenment. And Locke said this. He said that people, all people, are born with what he called natural rights. Things like life, liberty, and he says property. Okay, sound familiar? Should sound a little bit familiar. So Locke says people are born with these certain natural rights, and because they're born with these rights, they form governments to protect them. The purpose of government is not simply to rule people, it is to protect the rights of people. And Locke says if the government doesn't do that, if the government interferes with the rights of people, tramples on the rights of people, then the people have the right to overthrow the government. Wow. Think about that one for a minute. There's some people in our country who think we need to go back and read what Thomas Jefferson wrote. We need to go back and read what John Locke wrote and ask ourselves, is the government protecting our rights? Or is it time to rid ourselves of that government? I'm not espousing rebellion by any stretch of the imagination. But there are people who think that's the only way things are going to change. And they may be right. I don't know. I hope not. But I don't know. But that's an interesting thing. So, the Declaration of Independence is written. And one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is, why was it written? What's its purpose? Does the Declaration of Independence give us our freedom, our independence from Great Britain? How many of you think yes? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you think no? How many of you are scared to answer? Okay. Well, the answer is actually no. The Declaration of Independence does not give us anything. How did we gain our independence? We fought for it. Remember yesterday we said the Liberty Tree, the Tree of Liberty, is often watered with the blood of patriots. By people shedding their blood, by people fighting. That's how the colonists gained their independence. But the purpose of the Declaration of Independence is to show why. This is why we are rebelling against Great Britain. And there are 4 parts. The Declaration has 4 parts. The Preamble. How many of you know the Preamble to the Declaration of Independence? That is not it. To the Declaration or the Constitution? To what? This is not the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form more, that's the preamble to the Constitution. The preamble to the Declaration of Independence starts when, in the course of human events, a little different, but serves the same purpose. So there's a preamble, there's a Declaration of Natural Rights. Think back to John Locke. Thomas Jefferson unabashedly and unashamedly steals from John Locke this idea, and he doesn't use footnotes. Thomas Jefferson committed academic fraud. Yes. But honestly, Locke's thoughts had been around so long that it really didn't matter. Everybody knew where they came from. And so we have this Declaration of Natural Rights. Then we have this list of grievances. And a grievance is a problem that you have with someone or something. And then it closes with a resolution of independence. So let's talk about the preamble. It's simply the first part of the Declaration of Independence. It is an introduction. That thing you had to learn in the 5th grade. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, blah, 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 right? It's an introduction to the Constitution. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary. That's the introduction to the Declaration of Independence. And what the preamble does, it explains why. Why are we doing this? Why are we writing this? Why are we all going to pledge our lives, our honor, our fortune to this attempt to gain independence? That's what the preamble explains. Why are we writing this? Why are we presenting this to the world? And it does start when in the course of human events, I kind of teased you a little bit and gave you a little bit of it, but when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to dissolve the political bands which connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, when it's necessary for people to separate from their government, they need to tell people why. So, who is the Declaration of Independence written to and for? It's written to Great Britain. There's no mistake. But it is also written to the people of the American colonies. And you can go even further than that. It's written to the people of France. It's written to the people of Spain. It's written to the people of Somalia who yearn for a government that protects their rights. It's written to a world who looks to that document for hope of freedom. And so there's this obvious statement. This is why we're doing this. This is why we're doing it. Why we're separating. The second part lists the rights of the citizens. That is that Declaration of Natural Rights. And it explains something. It explains that in a republic, the government is there to protect the rights of the people. What is the purpose of the U.S. government? To protect the rights of the people. And there's a reason that when the President of the United States takes office, he basically says, I swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Why? Because it's that Constitution that protects our rights. All right, we'll pick up with this tomorrow. Whoop.